You were told the first civilizations created myths to explain what they didn't understand. That is not what the earliest records show. The oldest known texts don't read like imagination. They read like observation logs written by people who were trying to describe something they had no framework for. Before Egypt, before Babylon. In southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians pressed symbols into wet clay nearly 6,000 years ago. These tablets survived floods, fires, and the collapse of empires. And when translated, they revealed something that doesn't fit the narrative of mythology. They didn't describe gods the way later cultures did. They described presence, not divine, not symbolic, present, and more importantly, watching. If you're new here, subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear isn't theory. It's a pattern. One that starts earlier than history. Several Sumerian tablets reference beings that are not categorized among their gods. The terminology shifts. The structure of the language changes. Instead of names and stories, the descriptions become functional, detached, almost clinical. There are repeated phrases that translate roughly to those who stand and do not speak, and those who remain when the others depart. These are not titles. They are observations. In one fragment recovered from the ruins of Nippur, a line appears that has no direct equivalent in any known religious text. They were there before the counting of years, and they did not arrive with the sky. That distinction matters, because in Sumerian cosmology, even the gods had origins. They came from somewhere. They had domains, hierarchies, conflicts, but these entities did not. They are described as already being there. No arrival, no creation, no allegiance, just presence. And then there is the detail that appears again and again, the way they behave. They do not interact. They do not respond. They do not intervene. They observe. In multiple tablets, scribes attempt to describe encounters. Not rituals, not visions, encounters. And the structure of these accounts is consistent in a way that should not be possible for texts separated by time and region. A figure is seen. It does not move at first. When the observer moves, it adjusts. When the observer stops, it stops. There is no aggression, no communication, only synchronization. One translation from a damaged tablet reads, "It didn't follow me. It matched me." That is not how animals behave. It is not how humans behave. It is not how anything in known biology behaves. But the description doesn't stop there. The scribes note something else, something they repeat with unusual emphasis. The feeling, not fear, not exactly. Awareness. An overwhelming certainty that the observation is not one-sided, that whatever is being seen is also seeing in return. And not in a passive way, in a deliberate way. This is where the tone of the texts shifts, because the scribes stop trying to describe what these beings are and start documenting what happens after they are seen. References to silence, to absence, to areas avoided without explanation, and then fragments, missing sections, broken sequences, tablets that end mid-sentence. Officially, this is attributed to damage over time, but the pattern is too consistent. Descriptions begin, details increase. Then the record stops, abruptly, as if something interrupted the process, or as if the recording itself was not meant to continue. Modern translations try to categorize these passages as mythological exaggeration, but that requires ignoring one critical detail. The Sumerians were precise record keepers. They tracked trade, agriculture, astronomy, all with remarkable accuracy. Their observational consistency laid the foundation for written history itself. And yet, when it comes to these entities, their language becomes careful, restrained, measured, as if they understood that what they were describing should not be described incorrectly. Because unlike their gods, these beings did not demand temples. They did not ask for offerings. They did not speak. They did not leave. They remained. And according to the tablets, they still were. The question isn't whether the Sumerians believed in them. The question is why they wrote about them the way they did. Because belief creates stories, but observation creates patterns. And this pattern does not end in Mesopotamia. It continues, unchanged, across thousands of years, in different locations, in different conditions, described by people who had never seen a Sumerian tablet, and yet somehow described the same behavior, the same stillness, the same synchronization, the same feeling of being studied, not attacked, not approached, studied, which raises a problem. Because if these entities were real in Sumerian times, and if the pattern continues into modern reports, then there are only two possibilities. Either the Sumerians imagined something so specific that humanity has been unknowingly repeating the same hallucination for millennia, or they recorded something that never left. And if it never left, then whatever they saw is still here, watching. And in the next part, we're going to look at the specific tablets, the ones that were translated last, and the lines that almost weren't published at all. The tablets that mention them are not displayed in museums. They are cataloged, translated partially, and then referenced in footnotes that lead nowhere. When researchers describe them, they do it indirectly, by referencing translation difficulties, damaged sections, or ambiguous terminology. But when you isolate those fragments and compare them side by side, the ambiguity disappears. What remains is consistency. One of the most cited fragments comes from a set of tablets recovered near the ancient city of Nippur in the early 20th century. The official translation focuses on administrative records, grain counts, labor distribution, temple inventory. But embedded between these records are irregular entries. They are not labeled. They do not follow structure. And they are written in a slightly altered form of cuneiform, the same symbols, but arranged with unusual spacing, as if the scribe was slowing down. Deliberately. One of those entries translates to, "On the third measure of darkness, it stood at the edge of the field. No shadow, no sound." That line is not followed by explanation. It is followed by a return to grain accounting, as if nothing unusual had been written. This pattern repeats across multiple tablets. Normal record. Interruption, observation. Return to normal record. No transition. No justification. Almost as if the presence of the entity did not belong to a different category of thought. It was not important in the way we define importance. It was simply noted. Another fragment from a damaged tablet found in Ur describes something even more specific. It didn't cast a shadow under the sun, but it darkened the ground when I looked at it. This is not metaphorical language. Sumerian texts do use symbolism, but when they do, it is structured, poetic, repetitive. This is none of that. This is a contradiction being recorded exactly as experienced. No shadow, but a visible effect on the environment. And again, the entry ends abruptly. The next line resumes with livestock numbers. There is no reaction, no fear recorded, no attempt to explain, which is the most disturbing part. Because when humans encounter something unknown, they react, they speculate, they exaggerate. But these scribes didn't. They documented, and then continued. There is another recurring element, one that appears less often, but with far more detail. Distance. Several tablets attempt to quantify how far these entities were from the observer. Not in exact units, but in relational terms. Far as the ox can be seen. Closer than the well. Beyond the reach of voice. These are practical measurements. Agricultural. Human. But what matters is not the distance itself. It's what happens within it. In multiple accounts, the entity never crosses a certain threshold. It remains at a fixed distance, watching, not approaching, not retreating, maintaining position, as if the distance itself matters, as if there is a boundary that is never crossed. One fragment makes this explicit. It didn't come nearer, though I called. It didn't leave, though I turned away. That behavior is not random. It is controlled, deliberate, and it suggests something that the scribes never state directly, but imply through repetition. The interaction has rules, not human rules, not religious rules, but constraints, limits that are followed without exception. And then there is the final detail, the one that appears rarely, but changes the interpretation completely. In a partially destroyed tablet, a line survives that is unlike anything else in Sumerian writing. I was seen before I saw it. The structure of that sentence is important. It is not describing simultaneous awareness. It is describing sequence. The observation did not begin when the human noticed the entity. It began earlier, which means the encounter, from the human perspective, is already in progress before it is perceived. That idea appears again in later fragments, though never as clearly. References to being already within sight, to entering the place where it waits, not finding it, entering its observation. And this is where modern interpretations fail, because they try to categorize these beings as either animals, spirits, or deities. But none of those categories fit behavior that is consistent, non-reactive, and governed by constraints that never break. Animals react. Spirits interact. Gods intervene. These entities do none of those things. They observe. Only observe. And they do it with a precision that suggests purpose, not curiosity, not randomness. Purpose. Which raises a question the tablets never answer. What exactly are they observing? Because the scribes never describe being attacked. They never describe communication. They never describe being followed after the encounter ends. The entity appears, maintains distance, synchronizes movement, observes. And then, it is no longer there. Not leaving. Not disappearing dramatically. Just no longer present. As if the observation reached completion, and the subject was no longer required. If this were isolated to one tablet, it would be dismissed. If it appeared in a single city, It could be cultural. But it doesn't. It appears across regions, across time, across different scribes who had no connection to each other beyond the system of writing they used. Which means one of two things. Either this was a shared, constructed narrative, embedded into administrative texts for reasons we don't understand, or multiple individuals, separated by distance and time, documented the same phenomenon independently. And if it was the same phenomenon, then whatever they were seeing was not rare. It was recurring, consistent enough to be recorded, controlled enough to follow rules, and distant enough to never be confronted. But that distance does not mean safety. Because in the next part, we're going deeper into the one place the Sumerians explicitly avoided writing about in detail. What was below them. The Sumerians wrote about the sky in detail. They mapped stars, tracked planetary movement, recorded eclipses with precision that still surprises modern astronomers. They looked upward constantly, documenting patterns, cycles, and anomalies. But when it came to what was beneath them, the tone changed. Not curiosity, avoidance. There are references to the underworld in Sumerian texts, but most of them are symbolic, tied to death, ritual, and belief systems. That is what historians focus on. What they ignore are the fragments that don't fit mythology, because in those fragments, the underworld is not described as a place of the dead. It is described as occupied. One of the least translated terms found in these tablets is a word that appears in different forms: Kurnugig. Official translations render it loosely as the pure land below, or the unseen deep. But in context, those translations don't hold, because the term is never used in relation to burial, never used in ritual. It appears only in observational fragments, and always alongside the same implication. Something is there. In a tablet recovered near Eridu, often cited but rarely fully translated, a sequence appears that has been labeled damaged beyond reconstruction. But enough of it remains to understand the structure. It is not empty below the clay. The paths are not without step. That which does not rise remains. This is not symbolic language. It is spatial. Below the clay, beneath the ground. Paths, movement. Step, something that walks. And that which does not rise remains. Not dead. Not buried. Remaining. There are also repeated warnings, though they are subtle. Not commands, not laws. More like acknowledgments. Statements that something is known and therefore avoided. One fragment reads, "Do not listen where the ground is thin." Another, "The place where the well is silent is not for drawing." These are not religious prohibitions. They are practical, almost like instructions passed between people who understood that certain locations were different, not cursed, not sacred, just not safe. And then there are the structural anomalies in the tablets themselves. Certain entries shift orientation. Lines become compressed. Spacing narrows, as if the scribe was trying to fit more information into less space, or trying to finish something quickly. In one such fragment, the writing becomes uneven, symbols overlapping slightly, something extremely rare in Sumerian records, which are usually precise and clean. The translation of that section is incomplete, but one line is clear. "It moved under where I stood, not near, not at a distance, under." This is the first point in the texts where proximity changes. Until now, the entities remained at a distance, maintained boundaries, observed from afar. But here, something is directly beneath the observer, and the reaction is still the same. No panic, no explanation, just documentation, which is more disturbing than fear, because it suggests this wasn't unexpected. Another fragment expands on this idea, though indirectly. The ground was not still, though the wind was gone. Again, contradiction. No external force, no visible cause, but movement, and movement implies presence. Modern geology would attribute such descriptions to seismic activity. But the Sumerians were capable of describing earthquakes. They had words for it, clear, distinct terms. None of those are used here. Instead, the language remains observational, detached, focused on behavior rather than cause, which mirrors the descriptions of the entities above ground. No classification, only patterns. And the patterns begin to align. Above ground, stillness, distance, observation. Below ground, movement, proximity, concealment. And then there is one fragment, rarely cited, often dismissed, that connects the two directly. The ones who stand are not the only ones who see. That line appears alone. No context, no continuation. But it changes the structure entirely. Because until this point, the entities described were singular in behavior. Observers. Silent. Distant. Now there is implication of more than one type. Different behaviors, different positions, some above, some below, and possibly aware of each other. If that interpretation is correct, then the Sumerians were not documenting a single phenomenon. They were documenting a system, a structure of presence that existed in layers, above the surface, below the surface, and possibly between. This is where modern parallels become unavoidable, because the same distinction appears in contemporary reports. Surface sightings, distant, observing, non-interactive. Subsurface anomalies, movement, proximity, unexplained activity beneath. Different behaviors, same pattern, and always the same ending. The presence is detected, observed briefly, and then it is gone. Not chased, not captured, not explained, just gone. As if the encounter was never meant to extend beyond a certain point. Which raises a question the Sumerians never answered directly. If something exists beneath the ground, and something exists above it, then what exists in the space between? Because in the next part, we're going to look at the one distinction the Sumerians were very careful to make. These entities were not their gods. The Sumerians had names for their gods, clear ones, structured ones. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, each with defined roles, domains, relationships, and narratives. Their actions were recorded in detail, conflicts, decisions, punishments, favors. The gods interacted with humans constantly. They demanded offerings, built temples, issued commands. They were present in the system of life. But the entities described in the irregular fragments were not part of that system, and the Sumerians made that distinction carefully. In standard religious texts, the language is formal, hierarchical. The gods are addressed with reverence, with repeated titles, and consistent structure. But in the observational fragments, that structure disappears. There are no titles, no honorifics, no attempts to name, because naming implies understanding. And these entities were never named. Instead, they were referenced indirectly, the ones who stand, the watchers, those who remain. Not identities, functions, which suggests something important. The Sumerians did not classify them as beings to be worshipped. They classified them as phenomena to be recorded. One fragment makes this separation explicit. It appears in a damaged tablet that otherwise describes a ritual to Enlil. In the middle of the ritual instructions, a single line interrupts the sequence. They are not of the great ones. They do not hear the offerings. That sentence breaks the pattern completely, because it acknowledges awareness. The scribe knew of these entities, knew they existed, and knew they were not connected to the gods being worshipped. More importantly, knew they did not respond. That lack of response is critical, because in every known religious system, gods react. They reward, punish, demand, communicate. These entities do none of that. They are unaffected by ritual, unaffected by attention, unaffected by presence. They exist parallel to human activity, not within it. Another fragment reinforces this idea with unusual clarity. No incense reaches them. No voice turns them. That is not poetic dismissal. That is tested behavior. It implies attempts were made, attempts to interact, to provoke response, and those attempts failed completely. Which leads to a conclusion the Sumerians never state directly, but structure their records around. These entities cannot be influenced, not through action, not through belief, not through awareness. They observe, and nothing humans do alters that. There is also a noticeable absence in the texts: fear language. When Sumerians describe danger, floods, war, disease, their language becomes intense, repetitive, emphatic. But in these fragments, that intensity is missing. The tone remains controlled, measured, almost restrained, as if emotional reaction was either suppressed or considered irrelevant. Because fear implies threat, and threat implies interaction. But if these entities do not interact, then fear becomes useless. One of the most revealing fragments appears in a collection of administrative tablets, not religious ones. It reads, "They stood beyond the field as the work was done. They remained when the work was finished." This is not an isolated sighting. This is repeated presence, observed over time, during different activities, with no change in behavior. That consistency removes randomness. It removes coincidence. It suggests continuity. The same entities, returning, or never leaving. And then there is the final distinction, the one that appears only once, but changes everything. In a partially broken tablet, a line survives that has been translated with low confidence due to damage, but its structure is clear. The great ones speak. These do not. The great ones depart. These remain. Two categories, explicitly separated. Gods, active, vocal, temporary. These entities, silent, passive, permanent. That word matters. Remain, not appear, not visit, remain. Which means, from the Sumerian perspective, these beings were not entering their world. They were already part of it. Not above, not below. Within. Existing alongside human civilization without participation, without acknowledgement, without interference, but always present and always observing. If that interpretation is accurate, then everything that follows in human history becomes more complicated. Because every civilization after the Sumerians built its understanding of the world on layers of belief. Gods changed, names changed, structures changed. But if these entities were never part of those systems, then they were never replaced, never reinterpreted, never removed. They were simply ignored or forgotten, which is exactly what happens when something cannot be controlled, explained, or influenced. It becomes background, noise, something the human mind filters out until it is seen again. And when it is seen, the reaction is always the same: recognition without understanding, awareness without context, and a single, consistent realization. This is not new. In the next part, we're going to look at what happens when the distance breaks, because while most records describe these entities at a distance, there are a few that don't. Most of the records maintain distance. That is the pattern. Fixed range. No approach. No retreat. Observation without interaction. But there are a small number of fragments where that pattern breaks. And when it does, the language changes. Not dramatically, but enough. In standard observational entries, the structure is consistent. Location, behavior, duration. In these fragments, duration disappears because the encounter is no longer stable. One of the clearest examples comes from a damaged tablet fragment recovered near Lagash. The text is incomplete, but the surviving lines form a sequence that doesn't appear anywhere else. It was where it should not be. That is the first deviation. Until now, the entities were always described in expected positions, at the edge of fields, beyond wells, at visible boundaries. Now, something is out of place. The next line. It didn't wait at the distance. That confirms it. The boundary is broken. For the first time, the entity is not maintaining position. And then the structure shifts. The writing becomes tighter, the symbols closer together, as if the scribe is compressing time, or losing it. I moved. It did not match. It was already there. That line contradicts everything previously recorded. Before, movement was mirrored. Now, synchronization is gone, replaced by something else. Anticipation. The entity is no longer reacting. It is ahead, positioned, as if it already knows where the observer will be. This is the first indication of predictive behavior, and the scribe does not attempt to explain it. He records it, then continues. I did not see it come. It did not arrive. Again, no transition, no movement observed, just presence, where it was not before. This is consistent with another fragment, found in a separate location, with no known connection. The place between steps wasn't empty. That sentence appears simple, but it implies something critical. The entity is no longer bound to visible space. It is not moving through the environment in a way that can be tracked. It is repositioning, appearing in intervals, between perception. And the scribes notice this, not directly, but through contradiction, through gaps in sequence, through events that do not align with cause and effect. Another fragment expands on this disruption. I turned to leave. It was before me. No movement described, no crossing of space, just relocation, instant, unobserved, which introduces a problem, because everything else the Sumerians recorded follows continuity. Actions lead to results. Movement has direction. Time progresses linearly. But in these encounters, That structure breaks. And when structure breaks, the scribes do not interpret. They document the break itself. There is also a shift in physical description. In earlier fragments, the entities are vague, formless, defined by behavior, not shape. In these closer encounters, form begins to emerge, but it is inconsistent, contradictory. It had height, but no measure. It was shaped, but not held in shape. These are not poetic phrases. They are attempts to describe something unstable, something that does not maintain a fixed outline, as if its form depends on observation, or changes within it. One of the most disturbing lines appears in a fragment that is often dismissed due to damage, but the surviving portion is clear. It was closer than breath. That is the smallest distance described in any tablet. Closer than any physical measure. Closer than touch. And yet, no contact is recorded, which suggests something else entirely. Proximity without interaction. Presence without interface. And then comes the reaction. Not fear, not panic, something else. I could not begin the next thought. That line appears only once, but it aligns with modern reports. Cognitive interruption, not confusion, not distraction. Interruption. As if the process of thinking itself is being affected, not externally, internally. The scribe does not elaborate. He cannot, because the next line resumes normal structure, as if the moment passed, as if whatever caused it ended. And then, just like in every other fragment, the entity is no longer there. No departure, no movement, no fading, just absence. Which raises a critical question. If these entities can break distance, break synchronization, break continuity, then why don't they do it all the time? Why maintain boundaries in most cases and violate them in others? The tablets never answer that, but they suggest a pattern. Because in every fragment where the boundary breaks, something else is different. The location, the time, the conditions, and most importantly, the observer. In the next part, we're going to look at those missing sections, the fragments that don't continue, the entries that stop mid-record, because whatever happens after these closer encounters is almost never written down. The Sumerians recorded everything that mattered to them: trade, weather, labor, rituals, conflict. Continuity was essential. A record unfinished was a failure of the scribe, not the event. And yet, within the fragments that describe these entities, there is a pattern that does not exist anywhere else in Sumerian writing. Interruption. Not damage from time, not erosion, but structural interruption. Entries that begin normally and stop mid-line, mid-symbol, as if the act of recording itself was cut off. One of the most studied examples comes from a tablet fragment, cataloged in the early 1900s, but rarely translated in full. The preserved portion reads, "It remained when I," and then nothing. The line ends, not with a break in the clay, not with missing surface. The space is intact. The inscription simply stops. The stylus was lifted and never returned. Another fragment shows the same anomaly, but with more context. It didn't leave when I turned. It was still as I began to write the end. No continuation, no closing, no follow-up entry. And unlike damaged tablets, where surrounding text may provide clues, These interruptions occur in isolated segments, clean, deliberate, which suggests something unsettling. The recording was not lost. It was abandoned. There are also tablets where the writing changes just before the interruption. Spacing becomes uneven. Symbols are pressed deeper, faster, less precise, as if the scribe was no longer writing calmly, but trying to finish before something happened. In one such fragment, the progression is visible. The first lines are clean, measured. Then the pressure increases. The symbols distort slightly, and the final readable line states, "It is not at the distance. It is." Nothing after. No continuation. But the clay extends. The space was there. The words were not. Another example found in a separate excavation contains a longer sequence before the break. I see it where there is no path. It does not follow the ground. It does not wait. It is here, and then not here, and then. End. This fragment is often dismissed as incomplete. But again, the surface is intact. There is no missing section, only missing continuation. And then there are the rare cases where something appears after the interruption. Not continuation, not explanation, but a return to normal record. One tablet reads, "It stood within the place of tools. I could not begin the next." Break. Next line. Total grain, 36 measures. No transition. No acknowledgement. The scribe resumes accounting as if nothing happened, which is not how Sumerian records function. Events are not ignored. They are concluded. Closed. But here, there is no closure. Only omission, as if the event itself could not be completed in writing, or should not be. There is also a recurring absence of names. Sumerian scribes often identified themselves, signed tablets, marked authorship. But in these fragments, that disappears. No names, no seals, no identifiers. Anonymous records, which is unusual for anything considered important, unless importance is not the purpose, unless the purpose is simply to note and not to claim. One of the most disturbing fragments includes a line that appears just before an interruption. It is aware of the mark. The mark is believed to refer to the act of writing, the stylus, the impression in clay. If that interpretation is correct, then the scribe is not just being observed physically, but in the act of recording. And immediately after that line, the text stops. No further marks, no continuation, which introduces a possibility that is never stated in the tablets, but emerges from the pattern. The closer the interaction, the less complete the record. Distance allows documentation. Proximity interrupts it. And if that is true, then the missing sections are not random. They are consistent with a boundary, a limit, not just of space, but of information. Because everything the Sumerians wrote follows structure, except these entries. These entries approach something, and then stop, as if they reached a point where recording was no longer possible, or no longer allowed. And that pattern does not end in ancient texts, because in modern cases, the same thing happens. Recordings cut. Footage disappears. Reports end mid-statement. The medium changes. The interruption remains, which suggests the limitation is not technological. It is behavioral. Something about these entities prevents continuation. Not through force, not through destruction, but through presence. In the next part, we're going to move forward in time, because what the Sumerians recorded does not stay in Sumer. The same patterns appear again, in different languages, different cultures, different centuries, with one critical detail unchanged. They are still being seen. The pattern does not remain in Sumer. It appears again. Centuries later, in places with no linguistic, cultural, or historical connection to Mesopotamia. And yet the descriptions do not evolve. They repeat. That is the anomaly. Because human storytelling changes over time, details shift, interpretations expand. But when a phenomenon is observed rather than imagined, it stays consistent. One of the earliest parallels appears in records from ancient Egypt. Not the official religious texts, those follow strict symbolic structure, but in lesser-known inscriptions found on damaged temple walls and fragmented papyrus. Short notes, marginal entries, not meant for public reading. One such fragment, translated in the early 1900s and largely ignored, reads, "It stands beyond the light of Ra. It does not turn when called." That phrasing should be familiar. Distance, non-response, observation. Another line from a separate fragment. It was there before the torch was raised. Again, sequence, seen before being seen. The same structure as the Sumerian line. I was seen before I saw it. Different civilization, same behavior. And then there are the Greek accounts. Not myths, not stories of gods or monsters, but records from travelers, philosophers, and early natural observers. Aristotle himself wrote about figures at the edge of sight that remain still until the eye rests upon them. This is not widely discussed because it doesn't fit his broader work. It is an anomaly within the record, and anomalies are often ignored, but it matches perfectly. Stillness, edge of perception, reaction tied to observation. Later, Roman records contain similar fragments, though often dismissed as superstition. One account describes a form without outline, seen at the edge of a field. It did not move until I moved. It did not follow, yet remained. Again, synchronization. Not pursuit, not interaction, just alignment. Then the pattern goes quiet. Not gone, but less recorded. As if something changed in human behavior, or in what was considered worth documenting. But it returns. Stronger. With the emergence of modern recording technology. Because for the first time, observation is not limited to writing. It becomes visual, documented in real time, and the pattern does not change. In 1968, biologist David Ingram reported a human-sized figure in the Amazon rainforest. It stood upright, watched him, did not approach, did not flee. When he moved, it adjusted. When he stopped, it stopped. He described it not as an animal, but as something aware, deliberately aware. That is the same language pattern, separated by thousands of years, unchanged. In 2003, in Lichugila Cave, explorers recorded a pale, elongated figure deep underground. It froze in the light, then retreated. No aggression, no sound, no pursuit. Observation, then withdrawal, exactly as described in ancient fragments. In 2010, in the depths of Kribera Cave, a creature was found that did not match any known biological classification. It existed in isolation, without precedent, and like the others, it did not interact. It existed. Observed briefly. Then gone. And then there are the cases that align even more precisely. Encounters where movement is synchronized, where distance is maintained, where presence is detected before visibility. Modern witnesses describe the same sequence. They feel watched. They stop. The entity stops. They move. It moves. Not toward them. Not away. With them. Matching. Mirroring. Exactly. This is not behavior that emerges randomly across time. This is a pattern that persists, which means either human perception is producing identical errors across civilizations separated by millennia, or the same phenomenon is being observed repeatedly, with the same rules, the same constraints, and the same outcome. No contact, no communication, only observation. There is also something else that remains consistent. Institutional response. When these encounters are documented clearly enough to demand explanation, the explanation does not come. Instead, reports are minimized. Footage is removed. Scientists stop speaking. This is not speculation. It is a repeated outcome. Across different countries, different systems, different decades. The pattern is not just in the entities. It is in how information about them is handled, which mirrors the Sumerian fragments. Documentation begins, details increase, then the record stops or disappears. Different medium, same result. And then there is one final detail that connects ancient and modern accounts more clearly than anything else: the reaction of the observer. Not fear, not panic, recognition, a specific kind of realization that whatever is being seen is not discovering the human. It already knows. The encounter is not the beginning. It is the moment the human becomes aware of something that was already happening. That is exactly what the Sumerian line describes. I was seen before I saw it. And that line is not ancient. It is current. Because people are still reporting it. In forests, in caves, in open fields, different environments, same structure. Which leads to a conclusion that becomes harder to ignore with every repeated case. These entities are not appearing. They are not arriving. They are not emerging. They are already present, and always have been. The only variable is whether they are noticed. In the next part, we're going to look at something even more difficult to explain. Because the biology of these entities does not match Earth. Everything that exists on Earth follows constraints, energy systems, reproduction, adaptation. Even the most extreme life forms, deep-sea organisms, cave species, extremophiles, still operate within known biological frameworks. They consume, convert, and survive according to rules that can be studied, measured, and repeated. But some of the entities described, both in ancient records and modern encounters, do not follow those rules. Not partially, completely. One of the most overlooked details in the Sumerian fragments is the absence of biological description. No references to breathing, no references to feeding, no references to sound. Even when proximity is described, there is no mention of heat, smell, or physical interaction. Only presence. And when form is described, it is inconsistent, variable, unstable. It was shaped, but not held in shape. That is not how biological organisms behave. Form is structure. Structure defines function. But here, structure itself is uncertain. Modern encounters reinforce this anomaly. In 2021, An unidentified organism recovered from the Barents Sea could not be classified within any known species. Genetic analysis identified it as a type of worm, but it did not match any of the 20,000 documented variants. Its structure was functional, but not categorizable. This is not evolution. Evolution produces continuity, variation within boundaries. This was outside those boundaries. Another case involves deep-sea recordings near the Mariana Trench. A structure, not fully visible, extended a limb-like appendage toward a camera. The scale suggested a body size larger than any known cephalopod, but the movement was wrong, too controlled, too precise, not exploratory, directed, as if the camera itself was the point of interest, not the environment. And then it withdrew, not reacting to light, not reacting to disturbance, only reacting to observation, which mirrors the behavioral pattern. But behavior is only part of the problem. The deeper issue is energy. Every organism requires input: food, light, chemical exchange. Even the most isolated ecosystems, like the mobile cave biosphere, rely on chemosynthesis, a defined system, a chain. But some reported organisms do not appear to engage in any identifiable energy process. No feeding behavior, no environmental interaction, no observable exchange. They exist, function, then disappear. One of the most extreme cases involves a microorganism discovered in Puerto Rico. It demonstrated activity, movement, reproduction, but did not utilize any known biochemical pathway. No photosynthesis, no chemosynthesis, no oxidation. It violated the foundational model of life. The sample was confiscated, the research stopped. No follow-up publication. This is not how science operates under normal conditions, but it aligns with the pattern. Observation, recognition, interruption, silence. And then there is morphology. In multiple modern sightings, entities are described with features that do not align with Earth-based anatomy. Limbs that bend at non-standard angles. Bodies without clear segmentation. Surfaces that appear smooth, but reflect light inconsistently, as if the surface is not fixed, or not fully physical. One report describes a figure that had edges, but the edges did not stay where they were. That is not distortion. That is instability, as if the object is not maintaining a constant spatial definition, which leads to a possibility that is rarely considered. These entities may not be entirely bound to the same physical constraints as terrestrial life. Not supernatural, not invisible, but operating under a different set of structural rules, which would explain the lack of consistent form, the absence of biological processes, the ability to reposition without visible movement, the interruption of cognition, the limitation of documentation. Because if an entity does not operate within the same physical framework, then observation itself becomes incomplete, partial, filtered through human perception that cannot fully process what it is seeing. This also explains the contradictions in descriptions. Witnesses are not describing different entities. They are describing the same phenomenon from different perceptual angles, trying to fit something outside their framework into one, and failing. The Sumerians did not try to resolve this. They did not assign meaning. They recorded contradiction as contradiction, which is why their descriptions remain consistent. They did not interpret. They documented. Modern observers try to interpret, and in doing so, they distort. But even with distortion, the pattern remains visible, because behavior does not change. Stillness, observation, synchronization, proximity without interaction, and then absence. If these entities are not bound by standard biology, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Why do they follow rules? Because despite everything, they do. They maintain distance. They avoid interaction. They appear under specific conditions. They disappear after a certain point. That is not randomness. That is control. Which means whatever they are not just existing. They are operating within a system. In the next part, we're going to break down that system, because the behavior of these entities is not passive. It is structured. The behavior is not random. It only looks that way when viewed as isolated events. But when the Sumerian records are placed alongside modern encounters, a structure emerges. Not loose, not speculative, defined. The first rule is distance. In the majority of cases, the entity maintains a fixed range, not approaching, not retreating, holding position relative to the observer. This is not passive, it is controlled spacing. In Sumerian terms, it did not come nearer, though I called. In modern accounts, it stayed just beyond reach, no matter how I moved. Different words, same rule, which suggests that proximity is not arbitrary. It is regulated. The second rule is synchronization. When movement occurs, it is not independent. It is matched. Not mirrored exactly, but aligned. If I moved, it moved. If I stopped, it stopped. This is not pursuit behavior. Predators close distance. Prey increases distance. This does neither. It maintains relationship, as if the relative position between observer and entity is more important than location itself. The third rule is non-interference. No matter the conditions, the entity does not initiate contact. No attack, no communication, no physical interaction, even in close proximity. Even when closer than breath, this is critical, because it defines intent. If interaction were the goal, it would occur, repeatedly. It does not, which means interaction is either restricted or irrelevant. The fourth rule is conditional appearance. The entities are not seen constantly. They appear under specific conditions. Isolation, low light, reduced external stimuli, edges of environments, fields, forests, caves, thresholds. Not centers, not crowded spaces, boundaries. This is consistent across time. Ancient fields, modern forests, underground tunnels, open roads at night, different locations, same environmental structure, which suggests that visibility is not just about presence, it is about conditions. The fifth rule is termination. Every encounter ends the same way. No escalation, no conclusion, no resolution. The entity is present, observed, and then it is no longer there, not leaving, not fleeing, just absence, as if a process has completed, and continuation is unnecessary. This is not disappearance in the dramatic sense. It is removal from observation. And that distinction matters, because it suggests the entity is not bound to the observer's frame. It enters it, operates within it, then exits it. The sixth rule is awareness, not of threat, not of action, of observation itself. I was seen before I saw it. It reacted before I moved. It was already there. These are not emotional statements. They are structural. They indicate that the entity's awareness precedes the observer's, which means the encounter is not initiated by the human. It is revealed to them. Late. The final rule is limitation, not on the entity, on the observer. Documentation fails. Thought is interrupted. Records end. Footage cuts. Not always, but often enough to establish pattern. And this is where the system becomes clear. Because these are not independent behaviors. They are constraints. Boundaries within which the entities operate, and boundaries within which humans are allowed to perceive them, which leads to a conclusion that is difficult to accept. These encounters are not accidental. They are structured, not for interaction, not for communication, but for observation. Controlled observation, with defined parameters, distance, time, conditions, limits, which means the entities are not just present. They are operating within a system that defines how they interact with human perception. And that system hasn't changed. Not in thousands of years. The Sumerians recorded it. Modern witnesses experience it. Different language, same rules, which leaves only one question. If the system is consistent and the behavior is controlled, then what is the purpose? Because observation, repeated over millennia, is not random. It is data collection. And if that is true, then the final part is not about what they are. It is about what they are doing, and whether that process is finished. If something observes long enough, it stops being curiosity. It becomes process. The Sumerians never used that word, but their structure implies it. Because repetition without variation is not random, it is controlled. And when something is controlled, it has parameters, which means it has purpose. Not emotional, not symbolic, functional. One of the most overlooked aspects of these encounters is not the entities themselves, but what happens after. Or more precisely, what doesn't happen. No follow-up, no escalation, no continuation. The observer returns to normal activity, but something is altered. Not physically, not visibly, subtly, consistently. Modern witnesses describe it in different ways. I couldn't think clearly for a few minutes. I felt like something had already happened, but I didn't remember it. It was like I missed a part. These are not dramatic effects. They are small, but they repeat, and they align with the Sumerian fragments. I could not begin the next thought. That is not fear. That is interruption, which suggests the encounter is not just visual. It affects cognition, not permanently, but precisely, temporarily, as if a specific function is being paused or accessed. There is also a pattern in location after encounters. In multiple modern cases, individuals report returning to the same place without intending to. Days later, weeks later, with no clear reason, as if something incomplete is drawing them back. This is not proven, but it is repeated, enough to form a pattern. And patterns are what define systems. There is also the institutional layer. Whenever evidence reaches a certain threshold, it disappears. Footage removed, reports sealed. Researchers go silent. This is not consistent with scientific curiosity. It is consistent with containment, not denial, containment. Because denial would require explanation. And there is none. Only removal, which mirrors the ancient pattern. Records begin, details increase, then stop. Not erased, just not continued. As if the system applies not only to the entities, but to information about them. That is the key shift, because it suggests the limitation is not just physical, it is informational. There is a boundary to what can be observed, and a boundary to what can be recorded, and both are enforced, not violently, not obviously, but effectively, which leads to a possibility that changes the entire structure. The entities are not hiding, they are filtering, allowing observation to a point, then ending it, allowing record to a point, then interrupting it, allowing awareness, but not understanding, which is exactly what the Sumerian fragments show. They did not lack intelligence, they lacked completion. Every record approaches something, and then stops, as if the system itself prevents full capture. And if that is true, then modern science is not failing to explain these phenomena. It is being limited in how far the explanation can go. Not externally, structurally, because the phenomenon itself includes the limitation. That is what makes it different from any known natural system. It is self-contained, self-regulating, and persistent. Across time, across cultures, across technologies, which leaves only one conclusion. This is not a series of isolated events. It is a continuous process, one that began before recorded history, was noticed by the first civilization, and continues now, unchanged. And if it continues, then it has not reached its end, because processes end when their objective is complete, and nothing in the pattern suggests completion, only repetition, refinement, observation repeated under different conditions, different environments, different subjects, which leads to the final question. Not what they are, not where they are, but what they are doing with what they observe. Because in the final part, we're going to look at the only detail the Sumerians never wrote directly, but structured everything around. The moment when the observation ends. The Sumerians never described the end, not clearly, not directly, but they structured everything around it. Every fragment, every interruption, every incomplete line points toward a boundary they approached and did not cross. Not because they chose not to, because they couldn't. The pattern is consistent. The entity appears, maintains distance, observes. Then something shifts. Distance breaks. Synchronization fails. Continuity collapses. And the record stops. Not fades. Stops. Which suggests the most important part of the encounter is the part that is never written. Modern accounts follow the same structure. Witnesses describe the beginning, the presence, the behavior. Then there is a gap, minutes missing, details unclear, a sense that something happened, but cannot be recalled, not forgotten, inaccessible. And then normal perception resumes. The encounter is over, but not completed, because something is missing, always. One modern witness described it like this. It felt like the moment ended without finishing. That aligns exactly with the ancient pattern, because the Sumerians never recorded resolution, only interruption. And interruption implies continuation. Somewhere else. Outside the record. Outside perception. This is where the structure changes, because until now, everything suggests observation. Passive, distant, controlled. But if there is a missing segment, then observation is not the only process. There is a second phase, one that occurs beyond human awareness, not visible, not recordable, but present. And the only evidence of it is the absence it leaves behind. Missing time, interrupted thought, incomplete records. These are not effects, they are traces, indicators of something that occurred outside the accessible frame, which leads to the final interpretation. The encounter you perceive is not the full event. It is the beginning, the visible portion, the part you are allowed to experience. And when it ends abruptly, that is not the end. That is the point where the rest begins. Without you, the Sumerians approached that boundary repeatedly, and every time they did, their records stopped. Not because they ran out of space, not because they lacked language, because they reached the limit of what could be documented. And that limit still exists, because nothing has changed. The same pattern appears today. Different tools, different environments, same structure. Observation begins, awareness forms, distance collapses, and then nothing. Not darkness, not disappearance, just absence of access. As if the system closes, which means the final question is not whether these entities exist. The pattern confirms they do. It is not whether they observe. That is consistent. The question is, what happens after the observation ends? Because if the visible encounter is only the first phase, then every person who has seen one of these entities has already been part of something they were never able to perceive, and never will. The Sumerians understood one thing clearly, not what these beings were, not where they came from, but the boundary. They knew there was a point beyond which nothing could be recorded, and they stopped there. We haven't. We keep trying to capture more, record more, explain more, but the pattern hasn't changed. The limit is still there, and every time it is approached, the result is the same. Interruption, silence, absence. Which leads to the only conclusion that fits every fragment, every report, every missing piece. The observation is not for us to understand. It is for them to complete. And once it is complete, they leave. Not because they are finished being here, but because they are finished with you.